We spent the afternoon exploring place and history, and we're going to be featuring um, writer and archivist Grzegorz Kwiatkowski, who many of you are here with today. And we have the director of Mount Zion, Female Union Band Society Cemeteries, and we learned a lot about that. And so Lisa Fager, who is beside me, and Oak Hill Cemetery's archivist and collections manager. And you were wondering, who is it that's telling us about Oak Hill? And that was Laura Thoms, who has just been with us. Thank you so much for this. We will be joined by the director of George Washington University's creative writing program, Lisa Page, who will be reading with us now very soon, and the poet Martheaus Perkins. And each of us will give you a little bit of a background about our own histories, both from a literary perspective, as well as our new books or our forthcoming books. I think there is a lot of wonderful books that you'll all enjoy. And a little bit of a background about who I am. I'm Leeya Mehta. I'm the director of the Alan Cheuse International Writers Center, and we have spent a week across the region celebrating our 10th anniversary. We started with a lecture of ideas by Colin Tobin on stories of sanctuary. And we had a movie screening last night at the Goethe Institute, where a number of different organizations coming together to sponsor this week. And when you hear from Grzegorz, he will give you a little bit of a background on how he and I curated this event in partnership with Lisa and Laura, who were very generous because we came up with this harebrained scheme, and you all rose to the occasion with such generosity, and I am so grateful. But mostly I'm so grateful for the history of my city, where I've lived here since 2004. I brought up 2 daughters who went to DC public schools. My husband is here, Ryan. And I wanted to say that as we visit these cemeteries, we also acknowledge that many of us will never be found, never be buried, never be known, perhaps. We learned this yesterday when we went through the movie with Malta, where he was trying to find a child, the girl with golden hair, who was part of the archive of photographs in his grandfather's collection in Germany. And we hope that when he gave his archive to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, that perhaps that child who he was looking for will be found, and we can talk to him a little bit more about that. But there is this idea that many of us will not have a resting place. And acknowledging those power imbalances was part of the idea here. As we visited these cemeteries, we also were aware that ideas of home and last rites and how we continue to form community across the world changes, and we learn things and we witness new things in collaboration with our historians and archivists. I've lived in Georgetown and the surrounding region for 20 years, and for me, this experience feels like part of my history, not necessarily from the perspective of having lived it myself, but the history of the city that I'm interested in, and hope never to necessarily appropriate, because my history is different. And part of the conversation when we're talking about the peoples and communities who don't find necessarily the same outcomes and the same places to be recognized and to be seen, is that we listen and witness each other's histories without necessarily feeling that we need to make them ours and appropriate them as ours. And so in some ways we sort of stay on our own pathways and on our own tracks, and we talk about ourselves and we allow that space to breathe, because some of the injustices are not necessarily translatable across time and place and people. And so how do we talk about memory in that context? is also really important and exciting and interesting that we're at this time in history where we are able to actually do that in different ways. And so each of the writers is going to read and talk about themselves in their own way, in their own space. And it will be quite different. And then finally, we have inspiration coming from George Saunders and James Baldwin. And what will the lessons be? We want to hear from you. We'll talk more, but I want to start by giving the floor to Lisa Fager to say a few words to just frame us with her context, and then Laura Thoms for you to do the same, and then Grzegorz will take it from there. Thank you. That went on a little long, sorry.
Okay, it's only 5 minutes, so I'm gonna go with it. I know some folks weren't able to join us, so I'm gonna read whatever. Hi again, I'm Lisa Fager. I'm the Executive Director of the Black Georgetown Foundation, and that is the nonprofit that oversees the 2 oldest Black cemeteries in Washington, D.C., which is right over here. I already said that already. So, like I said, some of you weren't able to walk the Mount Zion and the Female Union Band Society Cemetery, so I want to just bring you to the space right now. The land. It began in 1808 when a Methodist congregation made up of both Black and white parishioners of the Black members, some were free, some were enslaved. They purchased the land for burials here in Georgetown. It was called the Old Methodist Burying Ground at that time. From the beginning, it was interracial, but not equal. By 1816, the Black members of that congregation formed their own church, which later becomes Mount Zion. And in 1842, on the west side of the land, there was another cemetery that was created by a group of free Black women in 1842. They came together to purchase the land. They were a mutual aid society. They might have played instruments, but think of more banding together, union. And so what they did as a mutual aid society, you paid 25 cents a month. And then if you were ill, couldn't pay your rent, or needed something, these women were there for you. And then with buying the burial ground, now you could die with dignity. It was very important to ensure that. But in 1849, Oak Hill becomes part of our history because over time, many of the white parishioners of the Methodist Church disinterred their relatives and reinterred them here and other white-only cemeteries around the city. So what remains, just a few blocks away, became primarily a Black cemetery, but one shaped by those in earlier histories. Today, when you walk through the space, it doesn't look like this. The landscape is different, the markers are different, and for a long time, the level of care was different. But what is there is something just as powerful. It is a place where memory has not been carried, not just recorded. One of the people we talked about was Reverend Joseph Cartwright. He was an individual there whose life connects to a larger histories. People like Reverend Cartwright, who purchased his own freedom and spent years raising money to purchase his children, his family, including traveling to see then Congressman John Quincy Adams, to ask for support to buy his grandchildren out of slavery. That kind of work, personal, persistent, strategic, is what abolition looked like on the ground. Another person we visited, there were people like Nanny, a child who was born in 1848 and died a week before her 8th birthday in 1856. We don't have a lot of documentation about her life, but her grave has become a place where people still come, they leave offerings. And I often describe her as an example of ancestral memory because even without a full record, she is still present. In 1894, a newspaper described the cemetery and noted how people left personal items at the graves, especially for children, toys, objects that connected to life. So even then, memory there was personal, intentional, and ongoing that continue and still exist, even now. Even after decades, when the site was at risk, even after headstones were moved during a long period of legal disputes and development pressure. The work today is about restoring that memory, stabilizing the headstones, reconnecting the names to the stories, documenting the people who were still being found. and making sure what has survived is not lost again. I'll close with this. When we think about cemeteries, we often think about what is visible, but some of the most important stories aren't always the most visible. Sometimes it's what has been carried, protected, remembered, and even when it wasn't fully recorded. And just a few blocks from here, that work is still ongoing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laura Thoms with Oak Hill Cemetery, and when George Saunders came to read here in 2024, it's kind of a long impromptu day where he did 2 events with us. He did a 10-person personal tour in the morning, and then he did this big lecture in the afternoon. And in spending 13 hours together, we were a little loopy. And at about 2 in the afternoon, he was like, you know, when I first did Lincoln and the Bardo at some of my readings, I would just have impromptu group readings. So his idea for the introduction to the lecture he gave was that we were going to do his version of Willie's service in the chapel, in this chapel, with about 10 of us reading. And it was really, really moving. And it was quite a surprise to the audience because people were just popping up and reading parts. So I'm going to read you just a little bit of Willie's service in the chapel. The only thing I'm not going to do is, it's a bunch of different voices with different citations, and I'm just going to skip that. I'm just going to read it as one long piece. They buried Willie Lincoln on a day of great wind that tore the roofs off houses and slashed the flags to ribbons. In the procession to Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, 2 white horses drew the hearse bearing the little boy who had only known happiness, but black horses drew the carriage in which sat the worn and grief-stricken president. The gale blew the roofs off tall houses, shattered glass windows, leveled fields of military tents, turned muddy streets into canals and canals into rapids. Gusts of wind destroyed several churches and many shacks, uprooted trees, blew out the skylights of the Library of Congress. Waves inundated the long bridge over the Potomac to Alexandria. The father drove unseeing through the wreckage. The carriages of the funeral procession stretched for so many blocks that they took a long time to wind their way up to the heights of Georgetown and to the beautiful Oak Hill Cemetery with its crown of oak trees. When the head of the cortege reached Oak Hill Cemetery by way of Washington Street, it was found necessary, because of the length of the line, to route a part of the line along Bridge Street into High Street. Climbing the hill past the new high-level reservoir, it turned into Road Street and proceeded eastward to the cemetery, where the body of William Wallace Lincoln was to be placed in the vault of W.T. Carroll in Lot 292. Now all was still, and the hundreds of people climbed out of their carriages and walked through the gates of the cemetery to the beautiful little red stone Gothic chapel with its blue-stained windows. At one moment, the sun came out and, pouring in through the small windows, painted everything inside with a blue glow, as if the bottom of the sea, causing a small pause in the prayers and a feeling of awe among the congregants. And that's where I'm going to leave it. And I should also add that these were the little scripts that George and I made. So if you want to see what our parts are, a little note from George Saunders, I have this. And every time he's come, he's written something in our hardcover book. So if you're a Saunders fan and you want to look at that too, I have that for you to look at. I hope I didn't read your part. Okay, he's ready. Okay.
It's great to be here. My name is Grzegorz Kwiatkowski, and I fell in love in this cemetery, in that cemetery, a few months ago, really. I will read you my spiritual statement, because I don't want to improvise. So I truly began my entire writing life because of American poetry, and more precisely because of Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River anthology. That book is a chronicle of a fictional town, but it is also a book of the voices of the dead of Spoon River Cemetery, speaking from beyond the grave about their lives. I come from Gdańsk in Poland. Gdańsk is where the Second World War began, and Poland was also one of the central sites of the Holocaust, one of the greatest genocides in human history. Poland is still a country haunted by ghosts and by trauma. Of course, our country is becoming more and more modern, but in the air and in family stories, there is still so much silence and fear. When I read George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, I immediately felt its kinship with Masters' Spoon River anthology, and George himself later confirmed that kinship to me. A year ago, I was here in Washington, a few months ago, I was here in Washington at the residency at the Alan Cheuse Center, and George wrote to me that not far from the place where I was staying was Oak Hill, and that this is where Lincoln in the Bardo takes place. I went to that cemetery once, then a second time, then a third time. Day after day, I fell completely in love with it. Then I discovered Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society cemeteries, and my love for them was just as great as my love for Oak Hill. Mount Zion and the Female Union Band Society cemeteries made a deep impression on me and reminded me of the country I come from, Poland, where hundreds of Jewish cemeteries were devastated, forgotten, and where we are only now slowly trying to restore and renew them. But let us return to graves and to the lack of graves. In 25 and 26, I'm working as an artist in residence at Yale, and I'm working with the Holocaust archives. I write poetry based on testimonies. I should also add that I myself come from a Polish Jewish German family that has taught me not to close myself off and not to judge people according to any political agenda, but rather to value diversity and the multiplicity of voices. I thought that this might be unexpected, but I want to read to you a few poems based on testimonies, poems about people who had no graves. And I thought that perhaps we, as listeners, can become a kind of grave for them. Our stillness, our open hearts can become a resting place for them, just as these poems can, and just as the beautiful surrounding hills of Oak Hill and Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society cemeteries can. I wanted these tragic, dark stories to be heard here, not in order to make you sad, but in order to bow with care and tenderness before human life, and before the importance of democracy, because when that democracy is dismantled, genocide and murder follow. Let us protect our vulnerability and our sensitivity from propagandists and from fascism. The world is beautiful in its diversity, and let us not try to polarize it and destroy it. And now I give the floor to the dead from Poland. Oh, and before I read it, let me add this. This is how the Spoon River anthology opens by Masters, and by Masters who brought me to Saunders, and Saunders brought me here on this hill. So this is the part of the opening part of the Spoon River anthology. Where are Elmer, Herman, Bert, Tom, and Charlie? The weak of will, the strong of arm, the clown, the boozer, the fighter. All are sleeping on the hill. This is how the Spoon River anthology begins, and now I will turn to the Polish Spoon River anthology to speak about Polish Jewish ghosts. But I strongly believe that we are all equal, and once you speak about one tragedy, you speak about all suffering, you defend the dignity of every human being, not only one group. I believe that literature does not exclude, it connects. And now, let others speak. Burning. Where are Isaac, Moshe, Vefa? They are all asleep here beneath this soil. Where are Rachela, Stefan, and Alexander? They are all asleep beneath this soil. In Stawiski, in Tykocin, in Radziłów, in Czyżew, in Drohiczyn, in Jedwabne. He had butchered 18 Jews, he told me this in my apartment, as he built in my stove. And the sun still shines upon his house and the generations of his family. You raped a Jewess behind the meal and then you slashed her throat. In the village he is greatly respected, despite being a bachelor, despite being decrepit. And to this day a sign hangs on his door: Jews, gypsies, and the devil is not welcome. He hit a child with an iron rod, brains splattering upon his clothes, and made its mother clean the mess. He worked in the fields, toiled late into the night. He was kind to his dying mother. Let us judge him not in his hour of need. They began beating her, turning her white body black. There was so much chaos in those days. Such everyday misdemeanors and transgressions might now seem something special. O Lord, thou pluckest us from their hands, burning, burning in the barn, burning. Buzia Weiner, born 1937, died 1943. I was 6 when I was killed. My sister Shulamit was 4. After we lost our parents, we wandered around Rokitno. We learned to sleep in the fields, and with time crept into cow sheds and drank milk from the udders of the cows. We didn't have a calendar, so we didn't know when it was our birthday, and ended up celebrating more than once a year this sad celebration. Dora Drogoj, born in 1923, died in 1941. Her head had been sawed off with a blunt saw, and nobody knows where she was buried. Perhaps it is a tall tale or an obscure joke, but her head had been sawed off with a blunt saw, and nobody knows where she was buried. Ida Fink. There is a small diary that David Sierakowiak kept. It's a tiny notebook that was later found in the attic, and it ends with a cut-off word. It is a straightforward diary. He writes how much a kilo of potatoes costs, how much bread costs, how many rations they received, and in his final entry he writes that he has heard that Germans have come to the village. The last sentence that I don't want to change goes more or less like this: they're pulling into the yard right now in a horse-drawn wag. Helena Merenholz. And I won't even talk about what the street looked like, or about how my little 4-year-old nephew would ask a riddle. What lies on a street covered with paper? Thank you.
I wanted to invite Lisa Page to come up. Thank you.
I'm reminded today of another burial ground from another time. As a child, I loved to visit a cemetery near my grandfather's house. It called to me with its winding paths, its headstones and obelisks. I made up stories that romanticized death, stories where the dead came to visit every night, even as by day they rested peacefully beneath the ground. My grandfather's house was in Muskegon, Michigan, where we visited every summer. The cemetery was our playroom. We also had the woods and backyards and front porches and even railroad tracks. My grandfather's house sat in the middle of a dead-end street, and the railroad tracks ran through the end of the block on an elevated embankment that we loved to see the freight trains rumble by. But there was a sinister side to those railroad tracks. They served as a partition between two townships and two worlds, Muskegon and Muskegon Heights. Muskegon was full of white people, and Muskegon Heights was full of black people. The street my grandfather lived on was called Dyson Street. Across the tracks, it was also called Dyson Street. But Dyson Street was paved on the white side. It was a dirt road on the black side, and the houses were run down. This scenario has presented itself throughout my life. Privilege and success, cheek by jowl, with neglect and deprivation next to access. I am an African American woman, but I'm also Welsh, West Indian, Seminole, and German. My German grandmother was buried in the graveyard I mentioned earlier. She migrated to the States after World War I. My African American grandparents also migrated shortly thereafter from the Jim Crow South to the North as part of the Great Migration in this country. My parents met in Chicago, and their interracial marriage was unusual in those days. My birth was proof, to some, that separate worlds could come together. But now in this moment of American polarization, my existence feels insignificant. Today, walking the grounds of these cemeteries, I'm struck again by the differences that still exist in America. The story told to us, the white story, is still one of value and respect, while the black story, meanwhile, remains one of erasure, shame, and loss. America used to be called the Great Melting Pot, but we haven't necessarily melted together. Divided communities remain. Yes, the American story is an international story. Yes, we are made up of immigrants, the indigenous, and descendants of the enslaved. But while much has changed in my lifetime, much remains the same. It's clear America is into celebrating some of its history, including its 250th birthday. Meanwhile, erasure is stripping Black history out of museum installations, books, historic landmarks, and more. Today I am struck all over again by the dichotomy between the white experience and the Black experience in this country. That dichotomy is demonstrated at Oak Hill, once a cemetery for whites only, a cemetery that is well tended, while Mount Zion and the Female Union Band Historic Cemetery, two Black cemeteries right next door, are examples of dissipation and neglect. Reverence for the dead mimics reverence for the living. Black history is still often forgotten or demonized and intentionally erased. The Black history in American history, yet Black history is American history. It is a story of assimilation, resilience, and survival. For me, it helps to remember these shared histories in this season of rebirth. There's a symmetry to all this, I think, to speak of the dead today in this season of the living. Spring resuscitates us with its color, its green pageantry, the smell of rain, the flicker of wind. This is the season of magnolia, tulip poplar, forsythia, of wisteria and rhododendron. Spring reminds us that renewal is inevitable and that our aspirations still exist. We can honor the dead, honor these hallowed grounds, and celebrate our shared histories with our eyes focused on the future. And we can aspire to be more than these legacies of access and division, neglect and displacement. We can extend our tenderness for the dead to each other, and we can maintain our capacity for hope. We can nurture our desire for what the American Constitution refers to as a more perfect union. We can rebuild. We can renew. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Martheaus Perkins.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martheaus. I'm coming to you by way of East Texas. I'm visiting here for school, and so it was really nice to see you all and to walk the grounds of the cemeteries that we were able to walk this morning. This is not the first time that I've been thinking about creative writing in regard to cemeteries. The hometown I come from is Center, Texas. It's in East Texas, it's a part of Texas you make fun of on TV. We ride horses, there's a bunch of trees. But there's a cemetery near my hometown in Jasper, Texas, in which there's a grave of James Byrd Jr. Some of you might be familiar with the name of James Byrd Jr. It made national news. He was out at a party, and two gentlemen after the party accused him of flirting with a white woman, and so they hitched him to the back of their truck and drug him to death. I was thinking about one of the people we were able to meet in the female Union Band Cemetery in Mount Zion Cemetery, whose name was Nanny, the little 8-year-old girl that Lisa was talking about this morning. But Lisa told us that there was actually a defacement of the grave, a fire set to the grave in 2003. Well, 2023. In 2004, there was James Byrd was killed in 1998. In 2004, his grave was defaced. They scrubbed racial slurs on his grave. And his mother, Stella Byrd Stella Byrd was her name. And her nieces actually would go out to the graveyard and clean off the racial epitaph that had been scrubbed on it. So I wrote a book about Black mothers and trying to give them grace. And so she was one of the mothers who made her way into the collection. I wanted to read her story. So this is after visiting Jasper, Texas. Many versions of this document tried to be nonfiction, tried to include the details of that 1998 evening. Metaphor, the chain, reclaim the pickup truck, make it pretty worded, make it new. But my fingers are too weak to keep telling of a man's skin grating off on an East Texas back road. I'll save kindling those more gruesome details from the pyre of a white page. Instead, while I hold myself awake, I'd like to try showing a mother, his mother. 6 years after her son's lynching, Stella Byrd scrapes her knee, scrubbing dead nigger graffiti off her boy's toppled gravestone. She's 79 years old. As her cut scabs, she will meet a governor, wail for reform, create a foundation in her son's name, as she and her nieces brush pine needles and boot scruff off James's plot. She will bite down on the bones of an old hymn, keep it from fluttering away. She will pray for many, many hours for those body desecrators. It would be a lie to tell you I believe in prayer, but I swear to this. Daylight faded into the breeze hours ago. I have paced this graveyard, staring at Miss Bird's stone, staring at James Byrd Jr.'s name, counting abandoned petal skins, waiting for a song. All while a bluebird, as sweet as our state's bonnets, has peered down, perched from a god's shoulder, weary, curious, I cannot say. And as far as truth goes, she is all my spirit can cradle tonight. I have one more poem to read. One of the ways in which African Americans have preserved our history through historical erasure is through the beauty of folk tales. My next project is about love stories that have been preserved within folk tales, oral histories, and tellings like this. So there's a story of a man named John Henry, who is known for being a miner, and he gets, he fights a machine and he saves everyone's job because he beats the machine. And he reminded me of my great-grandfather, whose name was Willie B. Jordan, who worked in a sawmill. And so I've created a kind of mixed character because there's not much known about my great-grandfather. He lost to history. And so this is a kind of combination of those two historical figures. The name of this poem is John Henry Returns from the Machine, 1945. And it's in his voice. Folk songs and foxholes. I want your dirt back in my mouth. A train ticket man was checking my connection stamp to Texas. I asked if a candy shop was near. Want to bring my kids something worth my leaving. He spat tobacco on my papers, told me, welcome home. No train speaks her traveler's tongue, but destinations have pale clarity. The day boss man laid me off from my hometown's mill, I was warring with a wood chipper. On my way out, I saw one fella catch a blue-tailed skink lizard. Irish boy called it luck, and they're doyens with that, so I stole the lizard from his thermos, planned to gift it to my youngest, who's taken to train hopping, but the critter got cut to death by the calluses of my hands holding it, trying to get it home. I smeared our porch with boot mud, began a reptile ritual, pacing on the porch plank, singing in delicate blues, baby, who's gonna shoe your little feet? Tell me who's gonna glove your little hand. Pollyann, my wife, was out back pulling weeds. I could have walked to her, squeezed her as weak as a promise, tossed the lizard at her slippers, could have said, I still have so much aching to let you mine from me. But I couldn't hear my wife admit that I've held her like a spike maul hammer since I got back. What could I father to our babies about clack-clack, fire and train track lining, the sear of whistles, gasoline breath, silica lung, being the boss man's favorite Negro machine? Honey, no strong man's left in me. I practiced my lies about my work, held luck's dead swollen ear to my lips, couldn't pray a thing soft. Look at my hands, Angel. This here is why you never ease your heart for a man. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much. One of my great inspirations is James Baldwin, and I know a lot of people say this. I happened to spend 2 years working on the centennial of James Baldwin. It was called the Baldwin 100. And so I had the chance to meet not just Jimmy and his different avatars in fiction and nonfiction, but also the man who was his official biographer, David Leeming, who came and spoke to us, and many of you all were there for that, and it was an amazing experience. So I wanted to read to you a little bit from David Leeming's biography of James Baldwin. And does everyone know who James Baldwin was? It's not always something I should take for granted. Does anyone not know who he was? Just to make sure, otherwise I would have given an introduction, which I don't mind doing. That's part of like being a university professor. It's lots of fun. David Leeming was spent a lot of time. He met James Baldwin in Istanbul, and James Baldwin spent about 10 years in Istanbul, and then most of his adult life traveling between France and the US, and of course he died in France. And there is two significances to this particular two passages that I'm going to read. They're towards the end of the biography by David Leeming, who's now almost 90 years old. He is actually 90 years old. The first is reflecting on the last years of James Baldwin's life. He says the following, and then I will quote from James Baldwin. And then the final chapter of his book is at the bedside of James Baldwin when he's dying. Hope for the nation lay in refusing to yield to that madness and in embracing community that could break down the delusions of color, or failing that, community of those who were even by the majority as the other. Real community, he wrote, in Evidence of Things Not Seen, as he had said many times during his career, involved risk, the choosing of honor over safety. The light is not great. I'm going to turn on my torch. And these are James Baldwin's words. It means doing one's utmost not to hide from the question perpetually in the eyes of one's lovers or one's children. It means accepting that those who love you and those who do not love you see you far better than you will ever see yourself. It means accepting the terms of the contract you signed at birth, the master copy of which is the walls of death. These ruthless terms, it seems to me, make love and life and freedom real. Whoever fears to die also fears to live. Whoever fears to die also must imagine, that another can die in his place. The dream of safety can reach culmination or climax only in the nightmare orgasm of genocide. And then this is David Leeming speaking of James Baldwin. So it was that the character David from Giovanni's room chose safety over his lover Giovanni, or that the sheriff, in going to meet the man, required the castration of lynched black men to maintain the safety of his marriage bed, or that the American dream had to be at the expense of the murdered children of Birmingham, Atlanta, and elsewhere. Baldwin's last hope was based in the evidence of things not seen but true. At the end of the fire next time, he had called on relatively conscious whites and relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others. Not to falter in our duty, but to dare everything, and in doing so, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. He no longer believed he would live to see anything resembling this hope come to pass, but as always, it was necessary to keep the faith. When Baldwin was dying, he summoned his friends around him, and David was one of them and came to see him in France. I arrived in Nice on the morning of the 21st and took the bus up to St. Paul. As usual, the outer gate was unlocked, and so was the door to the house, which appeared to be empty. I knew nothing about the rearrangement of the rooms. I found Jimmy in a large bed. He was barely recognizable. He had lost a great deal of weight and had a death-like sunken look about him. There was an ivy in his arm, and some of the blood had come off on the sheet from the needle. Jimmy woke up, saw me, smiled weakly, and said, "Hey, baby." We embraced, and I lay down next to him and conveyed greetings from mutual friends. He had asked for a few things from the States, and I opened the package and brought him Aunt Jemima's pancake mix, Aunt Jemima's syrup, Brer rabbit molasses, and some jelly beans. There was a spark of the old laughter, and he whispered, "We can't escape our culture." Then the smile faded into a confused, frightened look. Caring for Jimmy in his sickness was a logical extension of this ritual. He was insistent on not going to a hospital or having a nurse. He wanted men to care for him. Not, I was sure, because he disliked or mistrusted women, but because I was important to him, and it was important to him that men express the feminine within themselves, that they adopt the kind of tender nurturing usually associated with women. We became disciples of his gospel. Gentle men of the welcome table, To put it another way, we ritually experience the stink of love in Giovanni's room. Even as he was dying, Jimmy insisted on his role as a witness and lived his prophecy. I think that one of the things that moved me the most about meeting David and reading this passage was this returning men to their humanity. And it's beautifully captured. I don't have to explain it, but the sense that men should be involved in child rearing, they should be involved in all of the things that were often the purview of women and sometimes kept from them in different ways. And so the idea that they can participate in their feminine side and that men and women have masculine and feminine sides. Of course, Virginia Woolf talks about that a lot and how we explore both sides of our our wider humanity. I come from a very strange, small community from Bombay, India. I grew up in India and spent most of my childhood there. I came here as a 28-year-old and fell in love with my husband who's here. And we sort of had our romance in Georgetown in 2004. It was quite lovely. And sort of tied our fortunes to the city. And one of the first poems that was published in Poetry London in 2003 was this poem called The Towers of Silence. And it is about my community. We're 100,000 people that exist in the world. We're of Persian origin, but we think of ourselves as Indian. And we're refugees from what is now Iran, who made our way to India and prospered in an incredible way. Sort of the founders of the city of Bombay. And we have a very rich cultural tradition that is a mix of our heritage and also India, which we have a deep bond to. The interesting thing is about how we bury our dead. We have our own practices, and of course, they would not be considered kosher in this part of the world, perhaps in most parts of the world. This is a poem that I'd like to end with. It's called The Towers of Silence. 1. High on the hill, beneath a fern sky of speckled spores, there is a place I long to describe in a language I do not know. The passing of each beloved one into the rocks and ivory heart of the pit in that solitary place is not a passage we will accept for ourselves, Mother, you and I, nor did your father, who chose that box of fire, only fire. But the thought that we could all rest together in the sepia shadow of a pit drilled into the center of the core, that is not an empty wish, for after all, where will our children go to find us? Will they have to slice through the shifting sky like vultures, searching for me and you and your father, ashes choking the sea? How we thought your father's singed remains would be reduced in one biscuit box, but saw instead a suitcase of black static residue and small pieces of bone, and how you coughed. Wreaths of minute grey dust rose through the chimney of Chandanwadi. Chandanwadi is where the crematorium is in Bombay. From the chimney of Chandanwadi into the soundless glare of that June day. It is good, Mother, to have a resting place for family, a spot to mourn the passing of the centuries and that which we are, to remember. But there are places that I long to describe in a language I do not know. And the towers, by our not being in them, that is our sacrifice. 2. If you are an outsider, not one of us, you would be interested to know what happens when we die. Most of my people, if we have been blessed by our exclusive priests in our special temples, in our language, Avasta, which is a dead language, if we haven't made the mistake of marrying a man who is one of you, will be carried up the hill in Bombay on a cherished bar, up 2 stairs or 3 through a door, and onto a cement bed at the edge of a precipice. The birds do their job, eating us, if there are enough of them, and our antibiotics do not make them sick, and our bones are swept into the pit. The men who provide this service are poor, lower caste, and dedicated. They are born to the profession, body carriers, body sweepers, maintenance engineers of the towers of silence. 3. Must there be other words that can describe this place better than the ones I already know? Silent spectacles of words that form like clouds and beat thunderous drums with brocade batons. 4. Shadows in a garden of ochre thread. Vitiligo branches which echo the brown whispers of a festering peahen. Hayfields, grass grown yellow from the start. The English description of this hill is so still, so deathly quiet. Some other language would make more eloquent, more distant than Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Marathi. These are too close and yet impassive to my touch. There is no English green where gravesides rise like fresh dew-kissed soldiers in the valley of life. No Tintern Abbey, roof collapse. Not even a river here, blue and sweet. This is one landscape too burnt for English words. There is no poetry in the English sound. No rhythm there. So there must be some other tongue to say, there is a place I long to describe in a language I do not know. Thank you.
And we are at the end.
Thank you. If you have questions, you can chat with the writers, and we're around for a few minutes before we head out. Thank you for coming.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. I read the jewelry. Yeah.